Hello, thanks for staying. It's really nice to be talking with all of you. And I've inverted my title, so it's now Ibsen and the Supernatural, Trolls, Ghosts, Us, and that's because that's the order I'm going to talk about things in. First, Ibsen and the Supernatural, or to be more precise, Ibsen and the folkloric symbol. Then I'll talk about trolls, and specifically I'll talk about Ibsen's play Peer Gynt, which was his Scandinavian breakthrough, which was published in 1867. And then I'll talk about ghosts, and I will end with us. Hello, colleagues. But first, I guess I have to admit that maybe the supernatural as such is not really that important in Ibsen's entire production. And what do I mean when I say as such? Well, there are no ghosts in Ghosts. Maybe you noticed this. There are trolls in Peer Gynt, actual characters or actors who come on stage and depict the supernatural figure that is the troll, and the folkloric character that is the troll. But the title of Ibsen's play isn't even Ghosts. So in the original Norwegian, it says in the playbill that you have that he wrote in Danish. I had some Norwegians with me the first time I saw the production. They didn't like that. Dano-Norwegian, at least. The title of the original play is Gjengangere, which means something like again-goer. Maybe the best translation into English would be revenant. It means somebody who's died and then they come back. So there's overlap with ghosts, but it's not quite the same thing. I've got my cards here. So, also, now we're in 1881, right, when Ibsen writes Ghosts. And it would be kind of a funny time to be writing about the supernatural in some way, especially if we think of Ibsen as a man of his time or a man maybe ahead of his times. He's thought of as an innovator, a scandalizer. He wrote a play called The Master Builder, but he was called by his contemporaries the Master Razor for tearing down institutions, including marriage, for being deeply, deeply pessimistic. And it was a time of anti-superstition in many ways. It was a very science-centric time. Sometimes my students, when we read science from the 1880s and 1890s, are like, this isn't science, it's pseudoscience. And I'm like, yep, the science of 1880 is today's pseudoscience in some ways. It's also the time of the death of God. Nietzsche first says that in 1882. And of course, we have Pastor Manders, right, who is set up as a man of religion and maybe a man of, maybe superstition is not the right word, but certain kinds of beliefs that is definitely being made fun of here. So conservative thinkers in Norway were resisting attacks on religion. They were trying to defend more idealistic approaches to art. And in a recent introduction to the collected works of Ibsen, which came out in 2008 from the University of Oslo, they said, men den positivistiske smitten låt seg ikke stanse, but the infection of positivism could not be stopped. So this was a time that was all about science, positivism. We're not going to let metaphysical questions distract us from the facts, the things that we see in the world and experience. And I'll return to the notion of infection below, because that's obviously very important for this play. So I've titled my talk Ibsen and the Supernatural, and then I told you the supernatural doesn't really matter, but it does matter. And it matters, like I said, as folkloric symbol. And my answer to how Ibsen uses the supernatural is that both trolls and revenants are figures of perception and deception in Ibsen. And this is true in Peer Gynt in 1867, and this is true in Ghosts. And very importantly, in both of these plays, it's also self-deception that's going on here. Both Peer Gynt, the lead character of Peer Gynt, and Mrs. Alving are engaged in a very complicated form of deceiving others and deceiving themselves. So one very useful concept, I think, to think about from folklore studies is the notion of the empirical supernatural. And this concept is one of the reasons why I say these trolls and these ghosts or these revenants are are figures of perception and deception. So what is the empirical supernatural? Which sounds like an oxymoron, right? Basically, if you have partial data, or you're in an altered state, it's dark out, you're stressed out, maybe you're drunk, you get some data, right? Like some empirical, you see things in the world, you experience them, but you can't explain it quite, so you have to fill in the gaps, right? So this is part of folk science. You know, people said, oh, I had a healthy baby. Now, a couple days later, it seems like a sick baby. I can't explain it because I don't know what rickets is. So I think, oh, maybe it's a changeling. Maybe the trolls took my healthy baby and switched it out with a sick one. So there are many ways in which people used supernatural figures to explain what they couldn't explain to fill in gaps of knowledge. Is there anyone in here who's willing to admit they've seen a ghost? That's usually how that happens. How about a dark figure in your room when you wake in the middle of the night? Yeah, right? It's just a robe, but you're like, who is that? The stranger in my room. Ever been in the woods and seen a stump in the dark and thought, it's a bear, right? These kind of things. So that's you experiencing the empirical, not necessarily supernatural, but the empirical unknown. I have some data, but I don't know really what it is. I don't know what I don't know, and so I have to fill it in and make up stories. So the period of when Ibsen wrote Ghosts in the 1880s was a period of positivism. I think I've said that already. And positivism is supposed to confine itself to the empirical, right? It's supposed to say, we're not going to think about metaphysical things. We're going to exclude those things. But we might ask, did it, historically? Does it, still today? How do we know what we don't know? How do we know the gaps that we're sort of filling in? And so that's why I think it's really useful to think of that when we think of the supernatural or the folkloric in Ibsen, because part of what he's interested in is failures of perception and how that leads to forms of deception. So Ibsen himself was not a folklorist. He was a playwright, but he did actually do some folkloric collection. In 1863, he received a grant from the Norwegian government to collect folklore and fairy tales, and he traveled through the regions that are featured in his play Peer Gynt. In 1864, he leaves Norway, so shortly thereafter. And in 1867, he writes Peer Gynt in Italy. And I mentioned this already, but it was his Scandinavian breakthrough. It's what made him famous, not just in Norway, but also Sweden, Denmark. So he was taking part in a practice that was a kind of national romantic practice. A lot of people were traveling around Norway, writing down the fairy tales, trying to determine what is Norwegian culture. And he took part in that. And when he wrote home from Italy in 1867 to his publisher, he wrote, "It may interest you to know that Peer Gynt is a person who actually lived in Gudbrandsdalen, probably at the end of the last century or the beginning of this century. His name is still well known to the local community." So in that case, he had collected folklore and he was incorporating it into his work. He was just adapting it and modernizing it. So there's no picture of Ibsen in your playbill, which I was disappointed about, because I thought, oh no, you can picture the image in the playbill, which is kind of common. But I want to talk a little bit about the representation of Ibsen's person as I work my way toward Ghosts. There's a recent biography by Ivo de Figueiredo, who's a Norwegian biographer. And it's just come out in English, actually, so if you're interested, you can read that. It's a good biography. He has a chapter called Ibsen's Body, and his argument is Ibsen had no body. Ibsen was like a floating head. He was like a seer and a prophet, and he wore this black coat, and he just had this big floating head. And he had huge white hair by the time he got older, and he had these big white chops. But he also had one eye that was kind of droopy, and one eye that was really bright. And then you see that in photographs of Ibsen, but you also see it in visual depictions of Ibsen. Edvard Munch has a playbill, the Norwegian painter, has a playbill for John Gabriel Borkman, a late play, where Ibsen is just, his head is just floating like a prophet, and he's got that squinty eye and that bright eye. And even today, graphic novelists and people depict Ibsen with this one squinty eye, one bright eye. So keep the eye in mind. It'll come back. So again, in Peer Gynt, there are folklore trolls. There are many folklore figures. He's just adapting and modernizing them for his purposes. And again, I want to emphasize that this is about perception and deception. Peer spends the night with some herd girls, and he has an empirical supernatural experience. He's disoriented, he's probably drunk, and he looks at the mountains and he looks at the trees and he sees figures there, he sees trolls there. And then he falls down and hits his head, and he runs into a hulder, who is named the woman in green. And a hulder is a very desirable female figure, a troll. And if you ever get lost in the woods and you meet a very beautiful woman, you're supposed to lift up her skirt to check to see if she has a tail, a cow's tail. So this is another empirical supernatural thing, right? It was like, oh, well, I don't know, Jens went into the woods and he didn't come back. Well, maybe he was taken. Maybe he was taken by this kind of woman, or maybe he was bergtatt, which means mountain taken. So when Peer runs into the woman in green, she says to him, I wear silk and gold every day of the week. And Peer says, it looks like shoddy and straw to me. And the woman in green says, yes, but you've got to bear in mind, in my country, everything we own has two different ways of being looked at. If ever you visit my father's house, at first you might believe you stood in a wilderness of scattered stones. You'll think our gold is dirt and trash. Black can be white, and the ugly beautiful. So this is a scene of seduction and lies. He's telling her that he is the son of a queen. She's like, oh, well, is that true? You're not lying? He says, oh no, it's totally true. So she brings him into the mountain. And there he meets the Troll King, and the Troll King lets him know what he has to do to become a troll. He has to take off his Christian clothes, but he can keep his faith. He has to drink the homemade mead. He has to tie on a tail, and one of the troll courtiers asks him to wag it to see how he looks. And then he has to follow the troll motto, which is Vær deg selv nok. Be yourself enough. So not to thine own self be true, but be yourself and be satisfied. And the troll courtier asks, do you get his meaning? And Peer says, it seems obscure, while he's scratching his head. So he doesn't quite understand. What's the difference? What's the difference between being yourself and being true to yourself and being selfish? Hard to know, right? And it turns out humans have really great mottos, but we're not always good at living up to them. And so at the end of the play, we learn that Peer has lived by the troll motto the rest of his life. But the final thing that has to happen to Peer, so that he can see like a troll, he can see clearly in the troll world, is they're going to scratch one of his eyes and cut the other one out. And then he says, okay, but when will it heal? And the Troll King says, never. And that's when Peer backs out, because that's the kind of guy Peer is. He's like, oh, no, I'm not going to engage in anything permanent. I got to get out of here. And he somehow manages to get out. But that's why we have these two, one of the reasons Ibsen has these two eyes in depictions of his. One is the troll eye, one is the social critic eye. One eye looks inside at the psychic landscape, it looks at the monsters within, and the other eye looks out and does social critique. It looks at marriage, it looks at the church, it looks at other forms of sort of conservative or hypocritical institutions that are holding people back. So, again, a troll eye and the realist critic's eye. People often ask, is Ibsen a realist or is he a symbolist? And in which of his works? So one way we can understand his production is that he moves from verse or poetry and trolls in Peer Gynt to prose and unhappy middle-class wives later. And then finally, in his latest plays, he returns and takes even greater interest again in some symbolic figures. And that kind of works more or less as a description of Ibsen's production, but there are many exceptions. There are many reasons why we might contradict that or disagree or add nuance. And I would say that it's a both and, that Ibsen was always interested in politics, even when he was focused on trolls and folklore. Peer Gynt is one of the only plays that Ibsen sets outside of Norway. He has an act in North Africa, and he's very interested in capitalism, colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade. He has political interests. He's interested in critiquing the nation that is Norway, and he used the trolls to make a political critique of nationalism. So he's interested in all of these things all along. But he does turn to the unhappy bourgeois housewife. But I think he's asking a similar question, like, is she being herself? Or is she being true to herself? Or is she being selfish? Like, what is the difference between these things? And it still seems obscure. So in 1879, Ibsen wrote A Doll's House, which probably many of you are familiar with. He wrote it in Rome and Amalfi and Munich, so he was still living abroad. He wouldn't return to Norway until 1891. And this play was his European breakthrough. And many of you probably know it's the door slam heard round the world that Nora leaves, right? This is a play in which Nora leaves her husband and her children. It caused a great scandal. And so Ibsen writes a follow-up in some ways with ghosts. He says, okay, I'll show you what happens when the unhappy wife stays. And now the troublemaker, the person who we have to decide, is she being true to herself or selfish, is the unhappy bourgeois wife, as I've said. Mrs. Alving says in Norwegian, «Jeg går her og kjemper med gjengangere, både innvendig og utvendig. I go around here fighting with revenants, both internally and externally. So this might remind us again of those two eyes, right? The one that looks inside at the monster within, and the one that looks out and performs a kind of social critique. So the most famous passage from the play you've just heard, and I'm going to repeat it in my own translation, which is quite different. I do like this translation by Paul Walsh. I like how colloquial and everyday it is. Ibsen was colloquial and everyday. In a lot of the older English translations, he gets a little stilted. The English at the time were like uptight and took out all the swear words and things like that, so I like the everyday translation, but this is mine. When I heard Regina and Oswald in there, it was like I saw ghosts. Okay, and every time I say this, I mean gjengangere, or revenants, but I'm using ghosts because we don't usually colloquially use the word revenants. But I almost believe we are ghosts, all of us. It's not just the things that we have inherited from our mothers and fathers that recur, som går igjen in Norwegian, that go again. It's all kinds of old dead opinions and all kinds of dead beliefs and such things. It isn't living in us, but it's stuck there just the same, and we can't get rid of it. If I pick up a newspaper and read, it's like I see ghosts creeping between the lines. There must be ghosts living all over the country. I think they must be everywhere, like sand, and we're all so pitifully afraid of the light. So Mrs. Alving here is referring to inheritance, and there she probably means a physical, actual, embodied inheritance that we've received from our mothers and fathers. She's referring to beliefs, right? So also the morals and ideas of the mind and the soul, probably. She refers to a newspaper, right? So written things, public opinion, the ghosts are there too. And then she refers to the country, landa. So that's probably also a reference specifically to Norway as a country. So there were other people talking like this who were using the notion of the gjenganger in a non-folkloric way. For example, I'll give you just two examples. We have Hedvig Dom, who was a German feminist. She was married to the literary critic and editor Ernst Dom, and they ran a Berlin salon. And again, Ibsen was living in Germany primarily when he wrote this. And she published several feminist books in the 1870s. In 1872, she wrote a book called What the Pastor Thinks About the Wife. Might sound familiar. And she said, the tragedy of our society is that forms often outlive the spirit that once lived in them. And these dead forms, these specters, or gespenster, or it's translated as gjengangere in Norwegian, they're so unbelievably arrogant that they want to rule over living spirits in broad daylight. There's a lot of similarities there. It's possible Ibsen's wife read these books and told him about him. Told him Ibsen about them. That happened a lot. She was more of a reader than he was, or so he claimed. He always said, I read the newspapers and the Bible and nothing else. But there's kind of an idea that his wife read a lot and reported on these things to him. It's possible also that he read it and he's kind of stealing from her or borrowing. And it's also possible that that's how people were talking about these things, right? And so he has something similar to say to this German feminist. The other example is the French physician, Alfred Fournier. He definitely read Fournier, Ibsen, because he has very clear, explicit references to Fournier's book about syphilis, which he published in 1879, including the cherry red drape, the softening of the brain, rather, right, that he describes as cherry red drapes, and the expression vermoulu, or worm-eaten. And Fournier wrote, most specialists, oh, sorry, that's not him, that's me. Most specialists at the time believed that the disease of syphilis was mainly inherited from father to child, although such an opinion was controversial. Fournier argued, quote, parental syphilis can be inherited by children not only as syphilis, but also as multiple conditions of weakness and disease, as a kind of recurrence, there he's using the word revenant, of the parental diathesis in the parents. So here we see another kind of use of the term yengongira, not as folklore, but as a metaphor for inheritance. And in this case, arguing for a broad kind of inheritance, right? You don't just get the father's disease, you inherit his weaknesses. And people even thought at the time you could inherit your parents' moral weaknesses as well as their physical diseases. So in the playbill, there's a question, or there's a claim, that this is a very relevant play. And people are always asking that, like, is Ibsen old-fashioned, or is he perennially relevant? And the play's very funny. I was happy to see everyone laughing, because Ibsen is hilarious, and oftentimes that's kind of covered up in productions that are a little too boring and staid. So I like it that people were laughing. But I would say it's kind of a both and again, that there are many things about Ibsen that are very dated. Sometimes the melodrama is kind of intense in Ibsen, but there are definitely things that remain relevant. In his own time, there was an obsession with degeneration theory, right? So basically this was a scientific way of redoing the biblical sins of the father, which comes up in the text. This was the 19th century answer to that, with their empiricism, their science, their psychiatry, their social Darwinism. We could go way back in time, though, and we could think about Oedipus Rex, right? As a much, much older play. Ibsen is also playing with tragedy here, the tragic, the things you can't control. I think it says in the playbill that maybe we could be inspired to sort of, that we could stand up and stand against these things as individuals. And there's some of that in the play, but I think Ibsen's way more pessimistic than that. Because this is a play also about people who are screwed before they even have a chance to choose anything. By the people in their lives, by their societies, by the institutions around them. So I think it's quite pessimistic in a way. In The Children of Oedipus by Martin Muller, a scholar who's saying that Ghosts is a kind of play on older tragedy, Muller writes, in Ghosts, fate, or the oppressive past, is represented as a hypocritical society that conspires with itself to maintain a semblance of tranquility, and in which mutual deception, there's that word deception, mutual deception goes hand in hand with self-deception. Moreover, this process has gone on for so long that the web of falsehood enjoys the status of a long-established truth. Okay, that's troll stuff, right? The black can be white, the ugly can be beautiful. Lies can be the truth. And you've been told those lies for so long, you don't really know the difference. So he continues, it is this conception of society as the deliberate perpetuation of falsehood, which makes possible a genuine response to the Sophoclean motif of long oblivion, epitomized in Oedipus's question, where shall we find the barely decipherable tracks of an ancient guilt? So this is, Oedipus, was premiered in 429 BC, so we could go way back in time. Or we could come right up to the present. So I've talked to you about folkloric symbolism in Ibsen, given you some information about Ibsen's authorship, talked a little bit about trolls, a little bit about revenants, and it's time to wrap this up. So I'm going to wrap up by talking about us. Is the play still scandalous? Is it still relevant? Yes and no. You're both right. But one way I think it's absolutely relevant is when we think about what it is that comes back when you wish it were dead, right? What did you think was long buried and now it's here again, right? Or what did people in the past bury and now it's coming out of the ground and coming to light? This is something that's still really, really relevant for us. Since I'm doing okay on time, if you want to and you feel comfortable, what comes to mind for you? Like, what is undead in this sense of perception and deception in our lives? Maybe something you saw in the play that you're like, oh my God, there's still men like Pastor Manders, for example. But it could be something else, right? Something in your life. What do you think of when I ask that question, what comes back when you hoped it were dead? Or what did people bury and then it came to light? Just 30 seconds, just talk to the person next to you. Okay, I'm going to interrupt you, and I'm sorry, and I'm happy you're talking, and I hope these conversations will go on. I'm going to wrap up now, and I hope you will continue to talk about those things. I have a quick list. Maybe some of the things you mentioned came up, or some of the things you talked about I'll bring up now. The current rise in infections of syphilis might be something. The history of criminalization of STD transmission, which is ongoing. The question of assisted suicide, which is what the play ends with. Bad mothers. Inequitable marriage laws. Cishet men and women alike arguing that women are the weaker sex and we need to get this right. We need to get women back into the position that they should be in, which is serving men. Colonization, racism, anti-Semitism, and very locally Native children, right, who have been murdered and buried at residential schools and are now coming out of the ground. So those are just a few things. I know there's other things as well. So I'll just end by saying that Mrs. Alving is actually wrong about many things, and she's made a lot of mistakes, but she's right about Yengongera. And this play is relevant in the sense that it's a critique of arrogance and of burying the truth, but almost more importantly, it's a reminder that what you think is going on, what you think you see, is actually, there is a limit to it. There's a limit to what you can know. So I think it's a critique of arrogance in that sense. Our perception is limited. We're always filling in the gaps. We don't know what we don't know. And so we should all be very, very critical, like Henrik Ibsen. So thank you.